One of the key facets of creative bureaucracy is the idea of reimagining the kind of futures that we aspire to and the ways that we're bringing different societal actors together in order to get there. So it is a real pleasure to introduce you to two brilliant women who are really leading the way when it comes to reimagining in an area that you might typically refer to as the tourism sector. And I know this idea or construct itself is one that they'll be discussing further as part of this discussion. So Laura Aalto is the CEO of Helsinki Marketing, the Finnish capital's 100% city-owned marketing arm, which has a pretty strong global reputation when it comes to digital innovation in particular. And Signe Jungersted is the CEO of Group Now, an innovation and strategy agency which is doing truly pioneering work within the visitor and experience economy. And Signe was also previously development director at Wonderful Copenhagen, which is the Danish capital's official tourism organization. So without further ado, I will hand over to both of you to explore your really rather intriguing proposition that tourism is in fact not about tourism at all.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, Laura. Good to see you.
Hi, Signe. Great to see you too.
Do you want to start off first by why we agreed to say this is actually not about tourism? Is actually not about tourism.
Well, thanks, Signe. I must say that I love the title that you came up with first. I love these provocative titles always that that maybe are kind of like also tell a lot about how we look at the industry. Both of us, we've been talking for years and years together, and I think we share a lot of common ideas on this. And I think to put it very shortly and briefly, I think the easy answer is that tourism is an interaction between people. It's first and foremost about people. And it's a mixture of, you know, culture and history and business and dreams and geography and placemaking and identity and mobility and many more. So I think the definition of tourism narrowing to the term tourism is doesn't kind of like highlight the full potential what this interaction between people might have. Or how do you see it?
I agree very much. Actually, it's interesting because it was just a few weeks ago where I had to write something about the tourism industry, or I had to do an analysis of an industry, and I was Googling like, how do you define tourism as an industry? And I was Googling around it, and then I found out that there's actually a conversation going on. Well, there is always a conversation going on the internet about something, but you know that tourism is made up of 7 or 10 industries, and the fact that we call it the tourism industry can in many ways be misleading because, you know, as you're saying, it's all about people. It's, you know, it's almost like a human activity that by calling it an industry, we're commodifying the industry, but it's more of an activity really, and then within that activity, and we have different industries. So and that kind of got me started on thinking about that, and I agree with you. Very often, the complexities of tourism and the complexities of how integral it is to a lot of the other challenges that we face is just, for example, in cities, is overlooked somehow because we all have those conversations with people like, yeah, I've been a tourist too, so I know what it's about. You know, it's that simple view of tourism, really, which is, yes, a tourist, but not necessarily the entire picture of what tourism is all about. Yeah. So
yes, I fully agree with you on this one, and I think if we're looking back to the past year and a half. With the COVID-19 crisis and the kind of like this huge crisis what the tourism industry has faced in the past year and a half, I think it's also a huge opportunity for this industry to kind of like broaden a little bit that what it is all about and how it kind of like what's the identity of people working in the industry and who is involved there. I mean, who works there and who has feels the kind of ownership for the for this activity, as you call it? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. And I think both that we've seen out of the pandemic that people working within tourism have almost a new identity of what that means, and also an understanding of how it links across multiple different things. And at the same time, I think also people outside tourism have a renewed understanding, just because experiencing a world with no tourism puts it into focus in a different way, right? And I think some of the interesting discussions that are sort of coming out of that period is both, well, you're definitely part of those discussions as well. Like, when tourism comes back, how do we want it to look? Also based on this experience of having no tourism at all. And also within tourism, the discussion is around, and what do we take responsibility for? Like, how do we use tourism as a tool to build better communities and better cities and more, better lives, basically? I think that's like a key discussion, really, is how tourism is not a goal in itself, but a means to a better end. I think we've said that quite a few times within the industry. But then, of course, also, what does that mean, and how do we do it?
And I think cities should actually, and municipalities should actually now take this opportunity to kind of like have a broader discussion around what tourism can make for the cities, and I think because at least what has happened in Helsinki, and I guess in many other cities as well, that people are looking at their own cities in a completely different way. They look at this kind of like taking a break in a completely new way. I'm sure you've taken a staycation and you've been going to the hotel in your home city or neighboring city, but this is kind of like people are already starting to think differently about tourism. And this is an opportunity that the city, the municipality should not kind of like miss this opportunity of having a broader discussion, and having people be part of kind of like re-identifying or reimagining what the industry really is.
But what would you say? Because sometimes my impression is also that, tourism always expects to be seen as more and to be included and counted as a force for something, but also somehow stays within its own logic, if you know what I mean. So like, how does tourism break out of that silo, or take that seat at the table? What's your experience in Helsinki around that?
Well, when I joined Helsinki Marketing, which was previously called Visit Helsinki organization, I came from outside the industry. I don't have my background within the tourism or hospitality industry. And I find that's actually very refreshing on looking at the business here, because I have my background in marketing and comms and corporate partnerships, and I think organizations like wonderful Copenhagen or Helsinki Marketing or Visit Berlin and so forth, they should start hiring people outside the industry a lot more. I mean, if you only work with people who've been going to the same schools and same universities and, looking at the same things and doing things in a similar way, you don't question the things that you've done for years and decades, or maybe even decades. And for that reason, I think this kind of not only talking about that, we need to be on the tables where the decisions are made, but really kind of like inviting people to be part of the discussion and part of the strategy works and part of the kind of like future making, and not only kind of like asking the questions, but really inviting people in and making the future together with them.
Yeah, I agree. Tourism needs to be a much more open conversation, you could say, and because that will also make tourism more interesting. Because that kind of leads me to another train of thought around just coming out of this crisis. But even before, we'd had all these discussion about over tourism and the negative impacts of tourism, environmental and so on, and now a pandemic crisis. And when we talk about we need talents from outside the industry, we need people who with a fresh perspective, but maybe tourism is not really all that an appealing career path, coming out of this, and with the negative attention first, then the pandemic crisis, it's a very, it seems almost insecure. So I think even engaging in that open conversation and approaching tourism from all these multiple angles that open conversation will hopefully lead to, that should also be a way of making tourism an interesting field to work in, because I think that's actually a new challenge that a lot of the organizations that you were talking about, Visit Berlin, Wonderful Copenhagen, and so on, that they'll be facing moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting thought, and I think you are right on this one as well. But I think that also, because tourism is about people, it's a people business. So even though, if we travel less in the future, or we travel in different ways that we travel now, there's going to be different ways of experiencing and exploring the destination, but it's still people business. So even though we get all these new digital platforms and new ways of understanding a place that we're not so familiar with, I think it's still about people. So we need these links and these interactions, and I actually see that also in our tourism office services. Even though there are very little international visitors in Helsinki at this point, they've had huge amounts of contacts coming from abroad. All these chat channels and all kinds of new ways of interacting with people from outside interested in your destination. And so I think this kind of like interest of finding out what a place or a community or a culture that you don't know, it still stays with us. So we're still keen on understanding it, but it's just kind of like there are new forms in the future that we're not familiar with yet.
No, I think that's true, but that also, we need the open conversation you were talking about before around tourism. We also need that conversation to maybe even include the tourists in that, because it's also a question of how should you, or how do you engage with the local community. I think I have a thing for languages, so maybe that's why I think so. But there's also a lot around our way of talking about, our language within tourism, even that kind of doesn't support what you're talking about. Like just the fact that we talk about a destination, which, is not a community, or is, you don't live in a destination, but in fact, visitors or tourists are, they're traveling to a place where people live. And I think that connection is quite interesting. How do you bridge that? Which is, also what localhood was in many ways about, and also what you've been working with in Helsinki. But our language is really reinforcing those sort of almost barriers between those who are tourists and those who are locals, and keeping them apart. I think we have to come up with a new word.
Spot on, Signe. I remember when entering this industry 5-6 years ago, I never used the word destination before, and now I'm using it, as you notice. So, but it's cities. It's places and it's communities. What is this destination? And now I'm using it all of a sudden. So, but I think you're completely right. We're kind of like, we should make actually tourism more inclusive for all kinds of stakeholders, and more inclusive and more inviting for different kinds of stakeholders, and that's the same thing actually with the cultural sector, I think. Because how do you see it, Signe? Why has it been kind of tricky or difficult, the relationship between culture and tourism?
Yeah, I love that question, because it's so interesting and it always surprises me. But in my experience here, when I was with Copenhagen also, I'll make it a really short story, but I was tasked with doing a cultural tourism project. Like, you have to develop this and make it make sense. which is, as a sense maker, I kind of like those projects. And then, but I was trying to find out, like, I remember Googling desperately, what is cultural tourism exactly, and how is it different from any other kind of tourism? Because isn't it always about culture in one way or another? And then we were talking to cultural institutions, and they also didn't really, find any identity in the concept of cultural tourism. And just diving into that, I realized that both sides kind of they'd kind of grasped this concept that didn't make sense to anyone. And the cultural part, the cultural institutions, they were sort of looking at tourism and the tourism part in cultural tourism as almost like a danger sign of Disneyfying, or of Disneyfying their product or their offering, their services or their experiences, and also not being taken seriously, I think. And the tourism part was just really, really frustrated that cultural institutions couldn't see the value of all the visitors they were bringing in. So there was this major bridge between the two, which in Copenhagen, we were trying to sort of build that bridge by then turning it around and say, okay, let's do a tourism plus culture lab and see how do we link these two. But, at the same time, I think, I don't know, maybe the pandemic has changed it a little bit, because the cultural institutions have seen the need they have of visitors, or how much it's affected them to not have them. But yeah, I don't know. How's it been in Helsinki with cultural institutions and tourism?
I think this is a super exciting theme, and maybe you've heard about what happened in Helsinki around 5 years ago. The Guggenheim Museum wanted to open a new museum in Helsinki, and it was a major news all over the world, and they were really eager to come to Helsinki, and they were looking at the geographical situation. The St. Petersburg is 3.5 hours by train. I mean, good connections to Asia and so forth. And they wanted to come here. And they were talking a lot about the number of visitors coming to Helsinki. But they didn't understand, as an American institution coming to a Nordic society, I think what they didn't understand in their process was the community and the political climate that is here. So they were seen as an American institution coming with their money and with their resources and saying that, oh no, you don't have culture there, we're bringing you culture. And so the local kind of feeling turned against it, and it was actually the city council that voted for no, and they came up with the new new initiative, and the city council voted no again. So the Helsinki is a city that has twice turned down an American Guggenheim institutions that many cities were really eager to get to Helsinki, to their cities. And I think this is a really good example of the kind of complexity that there is between tourism and culture, and the reasoning, that how are you reasoning something new to come up with. And I think, I'm not to say that the Guggenheim should not have been placed in Helsinki, but the reasoning how they were kind of selling it was not kind of fitting to this community. And then, but sometimes something beautiful also came out of this project. So now is actually Helsinki is now planning a new design and architecture museum for Helsinki in the coming years, which is a homegrown project and really something that grows out of our own culture.
But I think that's really interesting, and I hadn't actually heard that story before, so even more interesting. But it's also interesting because I think in many ways, as we talk a lot about, the authentic experience, and what you were also saying around, visitors should be curious about local community and local culture. In many ways, the tourism organizations are depending on the cultural institutions and, the museums and art exhibitions and all these to to help translate that, to what you're saying is basically, because it didn't have that authentic root, it didn't come from Helsinki, it was not your DNA, so to speak. It was turned down, and now you have another museum coming out of, homegrown, as you said. And in many ways, that museum will help translate the bridge to Helsinki or Finnish culture, and how to get closer to that. And I think authenticity is the big challenge, because once something is proclaimed authentic, it's almost as if it just has the opposite effect. You can't say something is very authentic and then stay authentic. And and especially that's again, the language, how we reinforce something. It's either touristic or it's non-touristic, and everyone wants the non-touristic. Even the tourist wants the non-touristic, because that it's authentic, it's real, it feels not fake. And it's easy to somehow replicate that, but the cultural institutions, also in their depth of knowledge, and in their collections, in their curated approach to it, there's a whole depth of authenticity and messaging and bridging culture that I think is going to be core moving forward in getting to that point where tourism gets closer, you could say.
Yeah, very well said, Signe. I love to listen to you talking about these themes, and I think we could go on for hours and hours. I think one of the key points for many communities, cities, I'm not using the word destination here, but I think one of the key learnings maybe from this COVID-19 times is that that cities need to find new ways of kind of letting people to access the communities, so letting people in their own communities, and maybe we should, going back to your language, what you said about languages, I think maybe we should forget about the word tourists or tourism, and just talking about people and experiences and interactions between people, because we don't become different people when we travel, when we go to new places. We're still the same Laura and same Signe when we go to places we've never been to, or we go to places that we love to travel on a regular basis. So we're the same people. We don't become this somehow specific species of tourists, and maybe we forget about the word.
Yeah, that's true. Let's forget about it. Done deal. And then I would also say, coming out of COVID, I think even as someone who's traveled a lot, also for my job, and I think the COVID experience, or maybe more the pandemic experience, has also emphasized to me that tourism is not a right. It's not a human right to be able to travel anywhere that you please. It is a privilege. And I think that recognition of the privilege of traveling to places and visiting cultures and communities is, even for someone who's been preaching localhood for quite a few years, but I do sense that much stronger now coming out of the pandemic. And I think in recognizing that privilege as a tourist, though I wouldn't, call myself that, but but as a tourist, I also have a different appreciation of my responsibility in trying to figure that out, like trying to bridge that, get closer to have that experience. And then from the community and from the tourism side, or from now I'm afraid to say destination side, we should take advantage of that. We should use that to then build the bridges that we've been talking about for so long, and build into that new understanding and appreciation of what it means to travel to places, what we've been missing in our cities without tourism, and what we've been missing as those who couldn't travel. There's something really exciting, I think, about that will finally perhaps lead us to understand that tourism is about so much more than tourism.
Yeah. I grew up at the time when traveling was still pretty expensive, and I mean, living in a country that is quite isolated from the rest of the Europe. I mean, when I was studying, I didn't fly anywhere. I took the train because it was the easiest and cheapest way to go abroad. So this kind of like this something special that was part of this experience has somehow disappeared in the past, let's say 15 years, when it became kind of like, it became so everyday life of, let's do a weekend in Copenhagen, which is one of my favorite things to do because I love the city. But or let's go to Berlin for another weekend. So this, I think the reasoning why we travel will be different in the future. I think not only the COVID, but also the sustainability issues becoming part of. It's not only something that is outside our lives, but it's really it's embedded in the way we live our contemporary lives, and this the habit of looking at visiting places on a regular basis, and also for a very short period of time. I think we value that differently in the future.
I agree. But we're out of time, Laura. I just realized.
Yeah.
I saw the camera. But I think that's kind of a nice place to end as well. And well, we're not ending. We're continuing our conversation somewhere else.
Yeah. It's great to talk to you, Signe.
You too. Thank you very much, Laura. As always, a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.